And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist John Cowen with your aviation forecast. We'll start off taking a look at flying weather across the state for Wednesday. As you can see, we have several areas of IFR, mainly across the northern Gulf Coast into the Panhandle, as well as portions of the eastern Brooks Range and Yukon Flats, and finally across the North Slope. Otherwise, across the West Coast, generally things looking pretty VFR. Still some IFR in the southeastern Bering, but otherwise across the central and western Aleutians, we're looking at mostly VFR weather. Getting into Wednesday afternoon, that IFR begins to spread west across the Aleutians, getting into the central Aleutians by the afternoon time frame. We have a front that'll be moving across the central interior, so expect those IFR conditions to stretch from the eastern Brooks Range all the way into the western interior, and still some lingering areas of IFR across the North Slope, generally east of Barrow. And then across the Panhandle as well, still plenty of IFR weather across the northern Gulf as we have continued unsettled weather in the region. And that persists into Thursday morning, still IFR across southeastern Alaska, still IFR along most of that front. That's again spanning from the eastern portions of the North Slope across the West Coast. Marginal conditions otherwise across most of the Bering, and generally active pattern for most of the state. And then finally getting into Thursday afternoon, marginal conditions expected broadly across the Bering. Still some lingering IFR over portions of the eastern Aleutians and along that front that stretches into the northeastern Arctic. And then across the Alaska Range, we have some weather that'll be stacked up, mainly on the Cook Inlet side of the Alaska Range. You can see we have a band of VFR weather over the north side of the Alaska Range and over the Chugach as well, some IFR conditions there. And again, for southeastern Alaska, expecting more IFR weather. Let's take a look at our passes. Anaktuvik Pass, as expected, Wednesday, we're looking at IFR conditions. Same story for Adigan Pass, just as that front makes its way across the Brooks Range. Getting down into the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill Passes, both IFRs. We have impactful weather moving across the area. Rainy Pass, IFR as well. Windy Pass going to start off the day in IFR. Generally some improvement towards MVFR conditions later on in the afternoon as the front moves its way through the area. Same story in Isabel Pass. MVFR conditions expected for most of the day with VFR on the north side of the Alaska Range there. And then in Mentasta Pass, we do expect VFR conditions for Wednesday. Getting down to Tanita Pass, VFR conditions expected down there. For Portage Pass, we expect IFR weather for Wednesday. However, on the Cook Inlet side, we do expect improving conditions near the western entrance. And then finally, across the northern Panhandle, Chilkoot and White Passes, both expected to be IFR all day. Let's take a look at our freezing levels. As you can see, our freezing level extends down to the surface for most of mainland Alaska. That line's beginning to creep north, you may notice, over the last few days as we have warm air moving up from the south. Additionally, we do have some areas of warmer air aloft up to 4,000 feet for portions of the eastern interior and southwestern portions of Alaska. And then freezing levels up to near 8,000 feet over the southern portions of the Panhandle. So some pretty warm air moving its way north over the Gulf. So taking a look at our areas of icing, we have several areas of potential moderate icing across Alaska over the eastern Aleutians, expecting areas of moderate icing above 2,000 feet. That increases to about 4,000 feet over the northern Gulf of Alaska. And then over the interior, we would expect to see some icing from the surface up to about 10,000 feet, although cooler temperatures up here should keep these areas isolated for the most part, but there is some potential for moderate along the front. Taking a look at our jet stream, we have an area of pretty strong winds moving up across the northern Gulf of Alaska, up to 100 knots or so across the coast, getting into Prince William Sound there, up to about 80 knots or so over portions of southeastern mainland Alaska, up to 75 knots over the Panhandle. And we do have a stronger core of winds over the far, or just south of the far western Aleutians, with only about 35 knots or so expected out of the east for the central Aleutians. Coming down to 9,000 feet over most of mainland Alaska, we would expect to see winds out of the south to southwest, around 45 to 55 knots for most areas. Some stronger areas, or stronger winds expected along the portions of the Alaska Range, and then up to about 45 knots or so again over the northern Panhandle. And finally, coming down to about 3,000 feet, you can see we have about 35 to 45 knot winds across a good chunk of the southwestern portion of mainland Alaska. And things will be pretty turbulent in here again with the stronger winds moving up over the Alaska Range. So a good bit of variability with these winds. And then over the North Slope, we do have a core of some pretty strong low-level winds moving over the Utqiagvik region, around 45 knots or so at 3,000 feet. And then over the open Bering, winds generally out of the northeast, northeast around 40 to 50 knots. For areas of turbulence, With the strong southerly flow, we can expect some areas of potentially even severe turbulence from about surface to about 8,000 feet for portions of the Cook Inlet, Chugach Mountains, and even up over the Alaska Range. Otherwise, we're looking at generally moderate up to about 8,000 feet for a good portion of mainland Alaska, generally from Fairbanks south. And then surface to about 4,000 feet is what we'll expect for turbulence across Kodiak Island, getting into portions of the southern Alaska Range, and surface to 4,000 feet as well across portions of northwestern Alaska, the western Brooks Range, getting into the upper part of the Nulata Hills there, as well as St. Lawrence Island. And then finally, we do have one other area of turbulence out over the far western Bering, and this will be surface to about 3,000 feet there for that region. And that'll wrap up our aviation forecast. I'm meteorologist John Cowen.